routine. The blue coat really goes around now my rear view. I own the tail of an innocent being.
Hey, good morning and welcome to Ride Along Radio. This is our first segment here, so we're going to kick off with our introductions. We're going to introduce the show, introduce the host, and then we'll get into our topic for the day. This panel is comprised of retired law enforcement officers or former law enforcement officers. We felt that in our positions, with our perspective and our experience, it would give us a platform to answer questions people had, to speak on topics of the day without fear of retribution from our departments. So we look at it as you'll get straight answers from us on these topics. And we like to think we were pretty forthright when we were police officers too, but now that we're retired, there's really no reason for us to hold back. And so we can provide a unique perspective. My name is George. I spent almost 25 years in local law enforcement, worked a variety of assignments. I retired as a sergeant in a large canine unit. And so my background, I think, will lend some breadth and some depth to some of these subjects that we're going to be talking about over the course of the show. To my left is Gil, and Gil can tell you about his background.
Yeah, my name is Gil Contreras, and I'm a former officer with worked at one of the agencies that George worked at, mid-'80s to early '90s. And I'm also an award-winning journalist. I've done radio before, so I won a Golden Mic. I did public radio before. And this is what I covered. I covered police incidents for public radio, and glad to be here, George. Thanks.
All right. And here's Kent.
My name's Kent. I worked with George and Gil at this unknown agency in Los Angeles County. I spent a little time with Gil Contreras when he had a radio show at another time back in the 90s. Some similar topics, but it's been about 14 years. I've been retired for 18, though, so I've been out for quite a while. So hopefully my information is not too dated.
Well, and I'd like to add that, I'm a licensed private investigator here in the state of California. I have my own company. We do canine investigations. And so, my training is right up to date. I've been to CNOA trainings on narcotic stuff. We did dope school at Adler Horse. So I'm ready to do and talk about it from an honest perspective.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. I mean, every large police department has what they call a PIO, a public information officer. But that person comes out and they tell you what was scripted and what was signed off on by the chief of police is the message that the department wants to put out. But you'll never really get a chance to talk to officers in the car. That's the reason that we call this Ride Along Radio, is because as if you're in the car with officers where topics are discussed frankly. And so we like to think that that's the experience that you'll get here. And if you have any questions regarding law enforcement, we're more than happy to take those calls. I know a lot of people, especially in this day and time, there's been a lot of negativity. A lot of people typically approach me with questions when something negative has happened. That's part of the deal. We'll take those too, all comers. And if you have something positive to say about any positive interaction you have or any suggestions that you think might work on a larger social scale, we're glad to talk about those too.
Sure. And I'm hoping that this will be like, if you saw the movie, what was that last movie? With Jake Gyllenhaal.
Oh, yeah. End of Watch.
End of Watch, yeah. If
Right.
you saw that and you saw the interaction between the two officers in the car, when I saw it, I said, wow, somebody finally got it right.
Yes, exactly.
And
exactly.
I'm hoping that the experience the listeners will have with this show is going to be similar. It's like you're finally going to hear from guys who've been out on the street and giving it to you from a real perspective.
Right. And we'll keep it all respectful, of course, but it's going to be raw and it's going to be real, and that's what it's all about. And when I saw End of Watch, I said the same thing, that finally, because it's not Adam 12.
Right.
Okay? Maybe at one time it was that way, but it's been that way for a long time. And I thought they really captured the camaraderie and the kind of banter that goes on back and forth in the police car. And I've ridden in the police car with both of these gentlemen. I know the conversations that we've had. And, not always family friendly, just like some of the conversations in the car and on End of Watch. So that's kind of the thing. I think another unique thing that you'll find out about us is that although we have a similar background, we're all across the political spectrum in terms of the three of us collectively. And I think that you'll get some interesting takes on some of these topics. And Kent's over here smiling.
And diversity. I mean, look at the panel, for God's sake.
Here we go.
This is a very diverse, I'm Hispanic, George is a brother, and Then we got
and other.
and then we got the other.
Right, right. Right, or to borrow from the other show, right? The most ignorant with the least pigment. That's our. This is our guy for that show. So again, I think that this panel gives us a good foundation to come in and answer some questions and to talk about the topic. And the topic of the day actually is police body cameras, and are they really the answer? Because that's something that's been in the news a lot lately. In fact, there was just conversation about it today. NYPD has just put out a big study on that because there's been resistance from the police side, and then even from the ACLU, there's been some questions about the use of body cameras and in terms of how will the data be used, how will the data be stored, so on and so forth. So, that's something that it would seem to be a no-brainer should there be police body cameras, and I think everybody agrees that they do have their place and that they are a useful tool. It's a matter of how they get implemented, I think, and that's the tricky part, because there's concerns about privacy and everything else.
Right, and the other thing is the cost. When you have an agency the size of LAPD or the LA Sheriff's Department, putting a camera on every officer is one thing, but what about the data? Where do you store that?
Right.
How many servers do you have to have? How much gigabytes of space do you have to hold? How do you find it? How do you find something that occurred today at 3 o'clock in the afternoon 5 years from now for a court case or a civil case? Who's gonna maintain those files and how's it going to be? That's going to cost money, and the taxpayers are going to have to pay for that. And I don't know if people realize the actual cost of body cams. It sounds like a great idea, but I think at the end what we're going to see is that those body cameras on law enforcement officers are going to finally give the public an opportunity to see street police work the way it really is,
right,
from the officer's perspective. And I think it's going to help more officers than get them in trouble.
Oh yeah, I certainly say that. I think it has the potential to do that. And we're seeing officers, or rather chiefs of police, come out and say that my citizen complaints have gone down by 75%.
Right, that happened in Rialto, California.
It happened somewhere in Tennessee too, where they are saying, our citizen complaints have gone down. So now the question is, though, are the citizen complaints going down because the citizens know that the real story of what actually happened is on video, and so therefore the false complaints have been abolished, or are the officers conducting themselves in a more professional manner so as not to generate those citizen complaints in the first place?
Yeah, I don't think citizens even care. In fact, I don't think criminals even, I don't think they care, number one. But number two, I don't think people even pay attention. You could even say, hey, you're being recorded right now. Turn around, put your hands behind your back. If they think they're right and they're already have decided, I'm not going to comply with this officer, the fact
Right.
that the camera's there isn't even going to make a difference.
So what happens on the rest of the shift, other than getting out of the car and handling a radio call, or
Well, that's my question.
which seems to be the majority of the interest of what happens here, is the interaction with the community. That's not all of that, though. That's not what all that happens on a shift. No, that's the moment when everybody gets excited and the rest is boredom. But in the time of boredom, what are you doing? You're talking to people. What happens? Is that camera on when I'm talking to a potential informant?
Well, see, that's the question, and that's the privacy concern, number one. That's an investigative concern. And it's something that people don't think about who have not done the job. And that's why we have this unique perspective on it, because we understand there are conversations that people are not going to have with you if they know that they're being recorded, especially if they are an informant or a potential informant, and especially as strong as the whole culture of stop snitching is in a lot of the communities. People are going to be very hesitant, especially when you consider that you don't just walk up and develop an informant. That comes after you build rapport with that person, after being out in the community, being out in the field, and people feeling like they can trust you.
After numerous contacts.
Or it comes about as a result of an investigation, and you take the person and flip them.
Right.
Okay, but typically, from the patrol officer level, it's about you developing that rapport with people. And with that camera on, that's just not going to be something that people are going to be as open about. And like you said, what happens the rest of the shift? So we're riding around in the car together. Is the camera on while we're sitting there talking about our personal lives? Because that happens in the police car.
Right.
Is the camera on when I'm out at lunch? We're sitting down at Sizzler, and is the camera on?
I think LAPD's policy, LAPD's new policy is as soon as you get out of the car to do something, you have to turn it on. So the officers are they've been practicing, engaging the camera when it's time and then turning it off.
So it'll be like your radio.
Correct.
That's one of the things that you learn when you get out of the car.
And we know that sometimes you forget to turn your radio on when you get out of the
You
car.
sure do, yeah.
Or off.
Or
whatever. And so you're talking about electronics here, then what happens?
In moments of stress, absolutely.
And it becomes a discoverable issue then. You can't go back and erase something off the tape.
No.
So what was to me, the hardest part, or let me back this up. The easiest part of the job was dealing in the neighborhoods on patrol or whatever we were doing out of the station. That was, the bread and butter of what we did. It was the most easily understandable thing. But all of that then leaves and goes into a process in the department and in the judicial system and everything else. So what happens with that information when it comes time for dealing with supervision and investigations and people that may or may not like you and all of these things? What happens with all this information?
Well, some agencies, because of storage concerns and probably because of other concerns, are saying that you come in, like Taser now makes this pager-size camera, and Taser actually has a contract to provide the storage and everything for that. But a lot of departments are saying after 30 days, we'll no longer keep that data unless it's evidence. But we all know.
But you don't know if it's evidence or not.
And you don't know if a complaint of misconduct is going to come up on day 31.
Right.
But at least it's a start, and at least it's a policy, and at least it's something that is starting to get to lay the groundwork.
Right, and I think that another problem, if you will, with the cameras is when I was doing dope school at Adlerhorst last year, I was there with a guy from Rialto PD, and they're one of the agencies where they put the cameras on. Complaints against officers dropped like 75%, like you said, and but what the officer from Rialto was telling us is that because of the impact that it had on officer complaints, the DA now for the county, every time they were submitting a report or filing something to file charges, the DA saying, "Hey, do you have video?"
Right.
And if there's no video, they're much more reluctant to file the case because there's no video. Which so now the officer's word, it means absolutely nothing.
Well, and that's the thing, is that once it does become evidence, then that should go into a whole different deal in terms of storage, because there's that whole chain of custody. Even though it's electronic media and you really can't tamper with it, allegedly, you still have a situation where now that this is evidence, do you upload that to the DA server? Do you attach that with, because now it's all electronic filing now, right? So when you submit the arrest report, do you upload that file to go with it? And I'm sure they'll work all that out. But the big thing is, what is a good common sense policy, and how do we go about implementing them in a way that is a win-win?
Well, what I'd really like to see is when this is implemented, if it is important for people who have the public trust and who can take somebody's freedom away, et cetera, us in uniform, if it's that important, I would think that other people in the department, detectives, supervision, the chief, elected officials, including the city council and the mayor, and the city manager might need to wear those cameras wherever they go to, because do they not violate public trust? I mean, where do we start?
Right, but the mayor typically doesn't have the power to kill anybody.
No, he just has the power to take all the money out of the city and embezzle it.
Right. Okay.
All right.
That's a good point.
Okay. There we are.
That's a good point. So we see where Kent is on this. We're going to take a break, and then we'll come back and pick this topic up again. And feel free to call in, and we'll be giving the number out shortly. All right, and we're back on the Ride Along Radio. Again, I'm George. This is Gil, and this is Kent, and we all have a police background. Actually, we have a police background together. I started my career working with these two guys who were veterans when I came on the job back in 1989. So if you have any comments, again, call in, area code 323-293-3375, or you can join us in the chat room at morrismedialive.com. And we welcome your comments, questions, input, etc. So we were talking about, before the break, we were talking about police body cameras and how they should be implemented. And again, I think everybody would agree that they do have their place. I haven't talked to anyone yet who doesn't see how police body cameras could be valuable. because no matter which side of perspective you're on, if you're on the side that the police are always right and can do no wrong, I think you see that police body cameras are a way to vindicate officers who have been accused falsely. If you're on the other side of it and the police can never do any right, I think you look at it as a way of keeping police officers honest. So I think that everybody looks at police video cameras as a good thing. As a result, I think they're here to stay. It's just a matter of how they get implemented properly.
I think they're here to stay because of liability issues that departments are taking on. But I think at the end of the day, they're not going to make that much of a difference. People see what they want to see. And if you have footage of an officer using deadly force and you have an activist who sees that video and says, oh, my God, why did they shoot him? They didn't have to shoot him. It's not because of what they're looking at. It's because they don't understand use of force. How officers are trained in use of force. They don't understand the use of force continuum. They don't understand the options that officers have in dangerous situations as they escalate. And so what I've seen, what my experience is that civilians and activists and journalists don't understand use of force. It isn't really a training issue. It isn't even so much a camera issue. The camera's there is because people just don't believe cops anymore. They just don't believe them.
Right, and that's our fault. That's our fault.
Well, it may or may not be. We may have contributed to that to some degree,
Greatly.
but it's mostly the fault of the media and activists, and then police administrators kind of kowtowing to activism in a way that hurts street cops. The cameras, were the first time I ever saw a camera in the field was in the early 80s. With a guy named Don Jackson.
Right,
he
out
was
of Long Beach.
He was a sergeant out of Hawthorne.
Right.
And he went with a friend of his who worked for California Department of Corrections, and they drove into Long Beach, and Channel 4 had set up their car with cameras, and they had a news crew standing by nearby. And they wanted to prove that there was racism in the Long Beach Police Department. And sure enough, he drives into the city, they get stopped. And, one of the officers pushes Jackson against a plate glass window, it shatters, and then it all blows up from there. Then the next thing we see is Rodney King. We see the Rodney King video. Right. And way back then, I was the adjutant to the chief at that time, to our chief, and I remember saying to him, this camera thing is an issue because especially after Rodney King, not so much after Don Jackson, but after Rodney King, every time we did something, Every you made a traffic stop, you respond to a radio. As soon as you get out of your car, people were running out, and the cameras were huge back then.
Right, no camera phones back then. Right.
There were these big things you had to put on your, and you were lucky if you had one of the smaller ones. You could look through like that. But so that's been kind of the evolution. People, and I think people are under the misconception that if you put a camera on an officer, you're going to see them doing wrong. In my experience, I was teaching at a vocational college for the last 7 years, teaching Homeland Security, and use of force was part of that. So we looked at all these videos that are out now. My experience with the body cam footage is that generally it just clears the officer. If you understand the law, department policy, and use of force training, the cameras clear you every time.
Well, even if you had the option to turn this on and off, which I hope that you do, because you have many options as a police officer on how you approach a situation and how you take somebody into custody, what force you're applying, whatever. There has to be that type of choice being made by officers in the field because it's not automated. If you don't use your camera, which I believe, I agree with you. I think if the camera's being used and it's being used correctly, I would want it every time I got out of the car. If I was a black and white pushing a patrol car, I'd want it on. It will never work without having some system where the officer is going to be able to turn this off. And if he turns it off, he needs to state why he turned it off. He's having discussions with somebody. Not all this information is public information. It shouldn't be. It wouldn't be allowed in court.
Right.
There would be challenges in court how evidence is brought in. So there would have to be a system that you can turn this off, or you turn off the audio. But even the video, you don't want somebody to be seen that you're talking to, because when you're out on a patrol car, you don't have the luxury of meeting people at a restaurant, 5 miles from where you work. You're in a neighborhood and you're beating the pavement, and you may be getting a nod from around the corner from somebody about something that you've already got worked out. I mean, there's Many reasons. And that dash cam, and they've got policies for dash cam, and apparently they're turned on when lights and sirens are flipped, et cetera, et cetera. So, using that, in mind, there's got to be some discretion for the officer to be able to turn on and turn off. Just like a taser, you use a taser. If there's particles left on the ground that the taser has been used, there's got to be an explanation.
It's just going to be a pain in the butt. I have to think about this thing now. Right. Every time,
Well, like you said, it's a training issue. Just like to get out of your when you get out of the police car, you turn your radio on. When you get back in the police car, you turn the radio off.
Right.
It's a training issue. But what you said, Kent, was about the officer being able to turn it on and turn it off. That was one of the ACLU's concerns about this in their position paper.
That doesn't know anything about police work.
Right, but their whole thing is, and they're trying to really balance it out in terms of people's privacy. Because even though if there's a police officer in the room, there's no expectation of privacy. I think everybody understands that. Mm-hmm. But they're concerned that if there's a domestic violence incident, if you're brought to somebody's home, if you're called to somebody's home to handle some sort of family dispute, people's privacy is now being violated because now there's a government camera in their house recording all these private family things. And we've all seen things in people's homes that would be embarrassing to people if it was put out there. I'll give you another example. I remember this had to be mid-'90s, rape in progress call. Now, how often do you get those, right? Rape in progress call over on Soto, and I think it was 7th. We pull up, get out of the car, and the lady is running out of the alley, screaming, and she's half naked. I mean, she's literally trying to cover her nude body up. Her dress had been torn away with her hands. And I had never seen that kind of fear in a human being before. I mean, I'd never come up on a fresh situation like that where somebody had been violated, and she had been violated by multiple people. Now, that's traumatic enough for her. But to know now that there's cameras pointing at you, and that alley was flooded with cops. I mean, there was probably 5 or 6 of us at any given point. So now that there's 5 or 6 cameras pointed at you in the worst moment of your life, that's a privacy concern. And that's what the ACLU is saying. The ACLU is saying, where do we draw the line between what is necessary for investigations? How do we control these images to make sure that they don't end up in the wrong hands?
You can't. All you have to do is take all our technology today to know that that's going to be an impossibility.
Well, that's their concern, though.
There's even hacking that goes on. Obviously, our own federal government can't even protect their own employee files for 2 million or 4 million federal employees.
Right.
The NSA collects all data, forever, and it's metadata, but that's just what they're claiming they have. Mm-hmm. Emails and photos and phone conversations and everything else, depending on if you're listening to Edward Snowden or somebody else who has knowledge of this, is accessible. And then people start getting blackmailed and on the federal level. You go down to the law enforcement level, and guess what happens? You think that people aren't going to take that information out and misuse that information for any particular reason?
And the first time Anonymous gets mad at somebody,
or
gets mad at an agency, and then posts everything on the internet.
Exactly. Right. It'll never work that way.
Well, but see, that's why it has to be, and you can protect data if it's on a standalone system, and that's where your evidence, chain of custody and evidence, the storage and all that comes into play. So now what Taser has...
It's some civilian employee that doesn't want to download on a thumb drive, is what you're saying.
That's
is that right?
the thing. So it would have to be protected properly. It would have to be protocols in place. And here's what happens. And I don't know how this to me that means it would be unsecure. But what happens is that Taser has a service that they follow on. And I guess their cameras are probably lower priced, competitively priced. But you have to sign up for this ongoing program. Right. Kind of like when you buy a police dog. Right, there's this ongoing service that goes with that.
Ongoing training.
Okay, so there's an ongoing service from Taser, and what they do is the officer takes that pager-sized body cam off, and they put it in a dock. That dock then recharges the camera for the next day or the next shift, but it also uploads that video
to a cloud.
Server. Well, here's the thing. That's the question. That's the question. Is it to the cloud? Or is it to a standalone server, and it gets serviced somehow from there?
In somebody's bathroom.
That I don't know.
Like the one Hillary Clinton.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that I don't know. See, so there's your privacy concerns. And like you said, the first time they get pissed at somebody and they put all that info out there, then we'll have to rethink this.
Well, it would be the citizenry who's going to be affected by this as well.
Definitely.
You know, and you just gave a small example of it. I'm sitting here almost speechless thinking of all of the ways, because I haven't been in the patrol car in 18 years, all of the ways that this can be abused and how it will hamper 90% of your job, if you think about it.
But look at it like this. We found a way to equip all of our employees with lethal force, with guns, right? And there's problems that go along with that, but it's a necessary part of the job. And police officers must be armed in this society. If think of all the problems we wouldn't have if we didn't have armed police officers, right? But also, that's not realistic. So in this situation, yeah, there's some baggage that's going to come with that, but we got to find a way, because it is helpful to the agency, and it would be helpful to the citizenry done correctly. So I think the question is, where do you find that balance, and how do you do it correctly so that it works?
You have to give well, I'm going to reiterate this. You're going to have to give discretion to the police officer. There's going to have to be some rules when that thing needs to be on as a general rule, and what the exceptions are for turning it off. And if you're going to turn it off, it's going to have to be logged. There's going to have to be a document filled out, a quick whatever. I met with anonymous informant XYZ.
Right.
I can't even say why I met with that person, because you don't even tell your own supervision why you're meeting with that person.
Well, let's see. Okay, so then again, that's something else. That's another process. But and I'm just bringing the ACLU up because they are the opposing team on this. From the police officer's perspective. Although I have to say, to their credit, the ACLU has stepped in and helped police officers out when their rights are being violated. They're very even-handed about that. It doesn't happen very often.
In your experience?
But it doesn't happen very often. But I'm aware of instances where the ACLU has stepped in and protected police officers' rights. So they're very even-handed about that. But in this situation, they're saying if you give the officer discretion on when to turn it off, very quickly you'll see that there's not a real net value to this, because then the whole idea of it is being undermined. I think the idea is constant monitoring.
That's because the whole premise for these cameras is that we're now going to be able to catch officers doing something wrong.
Well, that's what I'm sure that's their perspective.
Finally,
sure.
We're going to have the video to prove what we've known all along, and
Right.
and that's just not going to happen.
And the information that's being used to kick this thing around and have this discussion is not necessarily accurate information to begin with, right? I mean, a lot of times it's hysteria and falsehoods that are being talked about how things work.
And even when you have video, and you have video that shows clearly what happened, you go, oh, okay, well, I see why the suspect got shot. One of the things that, because I still write and do other stuff, right? So one of the things that I've written about is, there's this question: why are so many unarmed people getting shot by police? Well, and then I go and I look at the video and go, wow, that doesn't sound cool. Let me go look and see, And then I watch the video and go, oh, well, now I see why. I see why the suspect.
As do a majority of juries and grand juries who view the evidence.
Exactly.
But there are those cases, and if anything, this will be helpful, because now you'll be able to talk about, or rather show, what actually happened. The problem is,
those cases are so few and far between. I'm not even sure it's worth the cost of all this stuff.
But what I'm saying is, the flip side of it is, it's a two-dimensional perspective.
Uh-huh.
It's not the same as being there in the moment and having to make the decision
Correct.
on the fly and everything else. Now, another thing I found interesting is the ACLU does not want officers to be able to review the video of an incident before they write their report on it. Now, right. Now, to me, that to me is stacking the deck.
Even-handed, you said, right?
Right.
Previously?
Right. Well, their thing is, well, if you're being honest and it just happened, to tell us what happened. But we all know that someone's recollection is not going to be as perfect as a digital video recording of what happened.
Look, Let me tell you, even eyewitnesses are the worst witnesses in the world, because they're under as much stress as the officer and as much stress as the suspect. And when you're under stress and adrenaline starts to flow and fight or flight or run kicks in, everything is distorted. Sound, time, and in the officer-involved shooting that me and my partner were involved in at 115th and Mona back in the day, a witness told the detectives that they saw me, the passenger officer, they saw me hanging out the patrol car window on the passenger side and pointing across the hood of the car and my gun, which I was doing because I was trying to get a beat on him because he had fired at us, and that I fired the rounds that took the suspect down. When in reality, it was the driver officer who, driving with one hand, rests his gun on the window while driving the car, and it's bouncing northbound on Mona at 115th, and the guy's running, and every time he's running like this, every time his arm went up in the air, I could see blue steel revolver. Blue steel revolver.
Right,
it was a
right.
Colt Python, for God's sakes. I could see the ribbing in it every time it went up in the light. But it was my partner who actually fired 2 rounds, hit him once, suspect goes down. But the witnesses were sure it was the passenger officer.
Right, and I had a situation like that. 98th and Avalon, I was in a shooting there, roll up into a gang shootout at 90th and Avalon, go figure, and I end up having to engage the suspects. Well, and this is where eyewitness testimony differs. The suspects pointed their guns at me, and that's why I discharged my rounds at them. Well, there were witnesses that said the suspect shot at me, okay? And that's why I discharged my firearm. Well, I don't recall them shooting at me, okay? Now, maybe that was because of stress. Maybe that's because of my perspective. Maybe because I was shooting too, and I didn't hear their rounds,
right.
But that's 2 different things right there. They're saying, oh, yeah, they shot at the officer, and that's why he shot back at them. I have no recollection of that, and we were both there.
Right.
Here's a perspective I'd like to give towards this is like I say, there's 90% of what happens before we ever get out of the car is some of the most important stuff that we experience and that we deliver onto the street by our attitude and by the things that we do. I can think of lots of things that are wrong in law enforcement. We all fought internally inside the department about lots of things that we knew were wrong. A lot of it was attitudinal by individual officers, things that they were doing that we know that would have gotten them in trouble internally in the department, but they weren't even out in the field yet. But these are things that paint a picture of an officer that should never be out in the field to begin with, or something needs to be, whatever they're doing needs to be, taken care of now before they even get out in the field. The end result of when they get out in the field are problems like we're talking about. These things just don't start when you get out on a call. These things start from the day that people will go through an academy and get hired and go through training.
Well, that's a selection process.
Yes,
issue,
but okay, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You want to know why. If you want to know why things happen, you need to look inside the department. So when I'm saying, I'd love to, if I were working again, I would want a camera. I would absolutely want a camera because of the amount of lying that went on during incidents that happened, witness testimony, lawsuits, everything else. I thought to myself, God, I wish I had that on camera. I wish I had that on camera. I would take that only if, at the same time, if we could split hairs here and with administration to say, there are a lot of other things I'd like to do internally inside this department.
Right, but that's not, they're not going to do that. And how
Of course
often,
they're not.
Right, and of course, and their thing is, well, I'm not out in the field. You're out in the field.
No, you're in the station in your office making policy decisions and doing other things and
yes,
and going after people and causing all sorts of psychological issues with officers and everything else. Nobody wants to know about what the officer is delivering onto the street before they even get there. Is the guy have a bad day? Yeah, his attitude was really bad that day. Yeah, no kidding. Guess what happened before he went out there? I'd love people to walk around the station with cameras and video recorders on.
I think we're getting out in the weeds.
I don't think that's going to happen.
I don't think we are.
That's not going to happen. We know that. Or if it does, it'll be a long time from now.
We're getting out in the weeds. But the one thing that you said that is interesting to me is that if you were still out there right now, you'd want a camera, and I agree.
Yeah.
But the reason I would want it is because the way I would do police work now is very different than the way I did it in the 80s and the 90s.
And why do you say that?
By choice or
because there was, it's this ongoing argument about whether cops are warriors or are they guardians of the community. LAPD has this whole training program now where they're trying to retrain the thought process of cop culture in Los Angeles to get away from this warrior mentality to this now guardian of the community mentality.
And that's fine, but you better have some warriors on speed dial someplace.
Well, you have, I think what some people want is, when we started the show, we talked about Adam 12 for a moment. Well, when I was a police explorer in hye school, it was Adam 12. And the cops that I met, the guys that even made me want to join police work were guys like Pete Malloy, Martin Milner, who just passed. It was their approach. And the cops, the real cops that I knew in those days, they were problem solvers.
Right.
They didn't see themselves as, quote, warriors, close quote. They saw themselves as protectors of the normal people. You had your criminal element,
Sure.
and that's who they dealt with. They were willing to step in between the normal people in the community who will if you're a normal person, you will never, ever have contact with the police.
Oh, unless you're a victim.
Unless you're a victim.
Right.
But they won't come to your house. If you're obeying the traffic laws, you're not going to get stopped. If your car's registered, you're going to be good. You'll never have contact with police. And so officers in those days, they left those people alone, and they focused on the criminals. When I came in '85, that was kind of our focus, as we were focused on, in the 80s, South Los Angeles was the wild, wild west. And if I told you some of the stuff that we did, you would just go, oh, my God, how'd you get away with that?
Right.
But it was the wild, wild west. And so we were the ones who were stepping in between the community and these guys who were fighting over turf to sell narcotics.
Well, that's what changed things, and that's how you brought about the police warrior mindset, in my mind, because then you had criminals out here with AK-47s. Okay, and you had people who were doing drive-bys and spraying bullets every place, and law enforcement had to step their game up. North Hollywood really brought about that. North Hollywood bank robbery, that really brought about a sea change in terms of what police officers were equipped with and had to be trained on how to use.
As significant as that was, that's still a rare occurrence.
Exactly.
Use of assault weapons is extremely rare.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And in my estimation, in watching how law enforcement has evolved, when I kind of see September 11th of 2001 as kind of the changing point, because after that, suddenly, the NYPD, who was under fire from the community on the 10th, on the 11th, they're heroes. Uh-huh. The FBI, who the worst crime lab in America, most underpaid cops in the world in America. On the 10th, they were nobody. On the 11th, they were heroes. And from that day forward, and then as all these movies come out, about Navy SEALs, and we see the evolution of law enforcement from the Adam 12 uniform to BDUs and tactical uniforms and vest covers, and now we have rifles at an angle, and I think that has fueled this warrior mentality.
Definitely.
Now officers are calling themselves, they don't call themselves peace officers as they're defined in the California Penal Code. They call themselves law enforcement officers.
And that's not truly police work.
It isn't.
It isn't. It's the guy on the footbeat. It's the guy walking between the buildings in the middle of the night.
Your job isn't to go out and find anybody who's committing any crime.
Right.
It's the criminal element. That's who people want you to go after. Right. We want you to go and engage gang members and dope dealers.
Right.
But you can't treat every citizen as if they're a potential
And this is how
suspect.
we got to where we are. This is why earlier, when you said people don't trust the police, I promised from the beginning I was going to keep this straight and keep it real. And the reason that police community relations are where they are, we have a lot to do with that. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say it's been all our fault, but every time there's a cop that gets arrested for something, every time there's a cop who's in a bad shooting or some kind of corruption, that erodes that public trust. Now, there's hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers in this country, okay, and the vast majority do a great job. But, we all know people who never should have been in law enforcement, or maybe once they came on law enforcement, their perspective maybe was bent a little bit and they went to the left.
And that's why I think law enforcement officers today, it's time for the old dogs to step up. These newer guys, and in order to make police departments more diverse, we've changed standards a little bit, and we want more minority cops. And if you think the police department should reflect the city that it serves, I think that's nonsense. But somebody thinks that's a good idea.
Well, and I think it's a good idea too, and I'll get into why I think that on the break. So after the break, not on the break, because I want to talk about it on the air. After the break. Okay, hey, we got a phone call. We'll take that call. Caller, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey, how you doing? This is Chuck. I'm calling from Baltimore.
Chuck from Baltimore. Okay. How you doing, Chuck?
All right. I wanted to call and just ask a question based on something. The host in the green shirt, I'm sorry, I don't know his name.
That's Gil.
Hey, I'm sorry. Regarding officers and the warrior mentality.
Yes.
One of the things I have an issue with is police who they wear like gloves with like the skull imprints on it, and they wear baseball caps and things with skulls on it.
Right.
If you're an officer, that to me, that warrior mentality isn't something that's going to come across in the street too well.
You know what, Chuck, and I'll let Gil address that because you direct the question to him, but let me say this. As a supervisor, if I ever seen any of my officers wearing anything that glorified killing somebody or death or whatever, they would have been dealt with, because why would you want to put that out there? And then those officers aren't thinking about the fact that if you do shoot somebody and you do kill somebody, that later on it's going to come out that you were wearing skull gloves when you shot and killed somebody. So what does that say? It says it paints a bad picture of your mindset, and that I can't believe that police supervisors are letting that slide any place. We never would have let that slide in the agency I worked at.
Right. Chuck, I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. And even though, I think in some ways law enforcement, police work itself has evolved and has changed. In some ways, it's still the same. And I think the LAPD's push to get away from this warrior mentality, I think it's a good one. And I agree with George 100%. While it may look cool at training or things like that, or private shooting things to wear the mechanic's gloves like I saw the Navy SEAL in the movie wear, that might be cool, but it has no place on the street.
No,
I think you're right.
Not at all. Not a domestic environment at all.
And I have another point. This past week, I'm in the habit now of when I see young black men especially being stopped by police, I'll stop my car. I will monitor and I will watch the situation, because a lot of times it's always the officer's word against the suspect's words. And a lot of times the suspect is automatically assumed, even if they have drugs or whatever on them, a lot of time an officer will go above and beyond. This past Tuesday, I saw 4 young black men in front of a high school being interrogated by 10 police officers, and 10 police cars pulled up, and like at least 2 officers got out of each car, and only one officer was asking questions, but the other officers were standing around them, and it's intimidating for a young person who doesn't know what's going on, or anyone. And it's like the police, they don't view that as an issue. They view that as
right. It's a safety issue. Officers look at that as safety in numbers, and while the optics on it may look bad, officers are always going to be concerned about their safety first and foremost. And not knowing what that situation was, we can't really say if that was overkill or not, or what the radio call was that brought them here, but to the scene. But in terms of you standing there or standing by to watch when that goes on, man, that's certainly within your right. And as long as you don't interfere with that officer or attempt to distract that officer in any way, and sit there and be a witness to it, I'm glad that you're actually taking that approach. I think you'll see more good police work than anything else by doing that. Chuck, thanks for your call. We have to go to a break now, but if you want to call in, the number is 323-293-3375. Join us in the chat room on morrismedialive.com.
Go and hit the ball when the Rex be out. Can't wait for the day when they let me out.
All right, and so we're back here at Ride Along Radio. I'm George.
Gil Contreras.
Kent.
Okay, and we were talking about, the topic of the day is police body cameras, and we kind of veered off that into the police warrior mindset or mentality. And I was going to tell Gil why I felt the way I do about that. I believe that it's necessary to have those people somewhere to do that. And this is from a former SWAT officer. I think there's definitely a need to have warriors.
Correct.
Because we have, in this day and age, we have super predators. They're not out there capering every day, but they're out there. And when that happens, you need to have somebody who can come and respond and who's trained to deal with that and equipped to deal with that and mentally prepared to deal with that. Someone who's got capabilities beyond that of your everyday patrol officer, because sometimes those officers get overwhelmed. That does not mean that the everyday officer who's out there in the field needs to have that sort of a mindset. Typically, depends on where you work, though, because where we worked and during the period of time we worked together, there was some pretty heinous stuff going on out in the streets. And that agency, without going into too much detail, when I was interviewed for that job, in my oral interview, I was told by the lieutenant who interviewed me, who went on to become chief at several other agencies, he said, this agency's a little different And that the average police department, most officers have not been in a shooting. In this police department, most officers have been in a shooting. How do you feel about that? And knowing that, do you still want to work here? Well, that set the tone for me in terms of what to expect. But I was 23 years old, and I just accepted that was part of the job, and I was ready to go out and deal with that. For a lot of people, that might have been something that was something they didn't want to hear, or something they didn't expect. But all of us who were there and all of us who stayed there understood that that's what was going on. And it wasn't unusual to hear automatic gunfire. It wasn't unusual for us to get in incidents where we had to use our guns. So that warrior mindset does have a place. It just can't be the only thing that you do.
I do want to say this, that, when, I remember being part of a team, and we would go into Nickerson Gardens at night, and we would, park just north of 112th Street, get on foot, and then we would just kind of snake through the projects. And I was the last guy in the line with a shotgun, so my job was to watch the roofs and watch our six. Everybody else, and pretty soon in Nickerson, it started calling us the creepy crawlers, because we would just come out of the darkness like spiders, and we were looking for people, selling drugs and involved in whatever else, any kind of criminal activity. And so if you're driving around, it's much more difficult to see these people between the buildings.
Sure.
And they see you and
Sure.
they whistle and then whatever. But so that's how we did it. And we did it in black raid jackets with blue jeans, and
Right.
I had the gauge. But even doing that, it was kind of special operations-y, if you will.
Right.
But we never thought of it as that. Like, I never felt like, oh, I'm a SWAT guy now, or I'm a
ninja.
special forces.
Right.
I was
Right.
I was a cop with a shotgun, and we were just doing a special kind of detail that night.
Back to the cameras. So you work in a housing project. This is not a typical city. Things are a lot different. 25% of the crime in the city of Los Angeles is happening in the projects.
Even though the projects don't make up 25% of the population or the
Exactly.
geographical area, right?
You are doing things differently. You're not doing things how you're supposed to do them. You're doing things how you can survive. One of the biggest causes of officer-involved deaths is the loss of control of your circumstances, of your surroundings, of your situation. You're working in a violent neighborhood like that, although when you're working it all the time, you find out that it's not always violent.
Right, exactly.
It gives you insight into, who's really a bad guy and who's really not a bad guy.
That's exactly right.
Right.
And I don't think most police officers get, are faced with that. Therefore, maybe in some cities where the crime's not that high, and suddenly they have something that happens that just blows them out of the water, then you get reactions and overreactions, and then here we are with the body cameras again. A lot of the stuff that drives that. But I could imagine having on a body camera, working where we worked and doing the things that we did and how we had to do things. Not that we were out abusing people, but it would be impossible for us. It's just impossible.
The optics would just be terrible.
Yeah.
Right, and that's part of something I always say. Police work isn't pretty. So somebody may look at someone being shot by a police officer, and there are people who are going to be mortified by that no matter what the circumstances are.
Right.
That guy could be shooting at officers, but when he gets shot, there's going to be people who are going to clutch their pearls because they're so horrified at what they just saw, and they're going to be offended by that. So there's always going to be people who are not going to side with people being shot, no matter how necessary we may have deemed it to be, no matter how within the law, policy, best practices it was. So you're always going to have that, and then the video cameras will never convince those people that needed to be done. But the flip side of it is if it's reasonable, the average reasonable person can see that, and especially if you give them some input where they can see it from your perspective based on the information you had at the time. And that's why I think that the cameras are a useful thing. I think that they're a good thing. I'm just concerned about how they will be used. Because here's the thing, if we abuse it, we'll lose it, right? And so, as with every other thing that happens, once things start getting out of control, then we find an issue. Now, intern Darren here researched and found out that the footage from those cameras from Taser International, yes, the same Taser that uses the electromuscular disruption devices, that is cloud-based storage. And that's probably the only way that they can manage all that data from all the police departments all over the country that they have accounts
Which makes
with.
it vulnerable.
Which makes it vulnerable because it's cloud-based, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and so that makes it vulnerable to exploitation.
It's always
And
vulnerable. It doesn't
there's
matter
gonna
whether
be an
it's
issue.
cloud-based or not.
Well, if it's standalone and it's secured, then it's less vulnerable because you actually have to come there to download those images as opposed to doing it from some keyboard in Taiwan.
A neat little world you work in.
Well, no, I
and
mean if
you've
it's
experienced.
standalone, if it's a standalone computer, and it's
Do you
not
remember
tied
how?
to anything.
Do you remember how Edward Snowden got all of his material? He got passwords from different people.
Right?
Got
Social
on the
engineering.
computers, got his flash drives, and downloaded.
But he had to
a
get
million
there.
and a half documents.
Because and he did that either from right there where he had to physically be, or he did it because it was cloud-based or it was web-based. So what I'm saying is if I have a standalone computer, a Mac computer right here, and all the things downloaded onto that, you have to come physically touch that computer if it's not connected to anything. That's what I mean by standalone. The problem there, though, is how do you then transmit that? And how do you...
I don't know how you don't plug into something. I just don't see it.
I don't know where this is going to go or how this is going to work.
Well, let's see, because it's coming, you know?
Well,
That's what it's here.
we probably have to wrap up here pretty soon.
We do.
But here's what I want. The last thought I want to leave people with, and that is this: cameras, they're not going to make a difference. In fact, I think if you're an activist or a journalist, you're going to be just appalled at how police work really looks and works. But here's what I used to tell my students. The outcome of any contact with law enforcement is dictated by your actions and behavior. The outcome of any contact with law enforcement is dictated by your actions and behavior. Whatever you do, don't make it escalate to the point where the officer feels he has to use deadly force, because he will.
And you can say that about police officers as well. You could teach them the same thing in the same class. The outcome of your situation is dictated by your behavior.
Well, it can be, but sometimes the bad guy's going to do whatever he's got to do to get away.
Well, no, I'm not.
But it can be, for sure.
Right. For a good part of what you do. I'm
Right.
sure it.
Well, and that's your
Probably.
contact with the public and everything, the outcome being dictated by attitude, too, right? For sure. So we are going to start wrapping this up here, but I do want to acknowledge, and as I said before, police work isn't pretty, and the downside of that is line of duty deaths. And so far in 2015, there have been 64 line of duty deaths. We had 62 at the same point last year. Every year since the 70s, line of duty deaths have decreased. Even with September 11th, I believe. September 11th might have been the one anomaly that caused the line of duty death number to spike. But typically, with the exception of that one terrorist event on that day, or those terrorist events on that day, law enforcement deaths have gone down. And that's for a couple of reasons. Not necessarily because crime has gone down. It's because a lot of officers were dying in car crashes, and now we have better technology for that. But it's still a very dangerous job, and I just want to acknowledge the sacrifice of the 64 officers who died in the line of duty this year. Also, we're going to be doing a tip of the week every week, and it's just something for us to pass to you as citizens, and how maybe you can keep yourself a little safer, make your life a little better. How many times are you going to take a burglary report from somebody's house and they really don't have any idea of what was missing, or if they know what was missing, they don't have serial numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And how many items have you seen sitting in police property that will never make their way back to the owners, even though they were recovered, because they weren't properly reported stolen? That's something that's common, and a way you can protect yourself from that. Maybe you can't stop somebody from breaking into your house. I mean, there's ways for that, but that's another tip of the week. What you can do and do yourself a favor is you can record the serial numbers on your property, cloud-based, right? Put it on your note on your iPhone or whatever, the brand, the model, and the serial number of whatever it is. If it's your flat screen TV, if it's your DVD player, anything that you have, expensive watches or whatever in your house, and get a good description and take pictures. And if those items are ever recovered, you stand a very good chance of getting those items back later. And it won't end up in a police auction, or it won't end up disposed someplace else. And it will also help tie that person that is arrested to the burglary at your house. And so they'll see justice on that too. So that's our tip of the week. Again, we will be back at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time next Thursday. That's going to be October 8th. And the call-in number is 323-293-3375. Our chat room is morrismedialive.com. Kent, did you have anything did you want to say in closing?
No, just glad to be here. Good experience. Looking forward to it next time.
All right.
My tip of the week is behave yourself out there, and you'll be fine.
There you go. All right. Well, we'll see you folks next week, and thanks for tuning in.